Hi. So my guest today for We Are HR is Tracey Fox, and I've met Tracey through work, and always admired her experience and her lovely calm voice, and I invited her on the show really because as a HR practitioner, we are often in situations where we need to manage conflict, whether it be conflict between line managers or conflict between two employees. It's something that we need to understand how to manage and also be aware of prior to the conflict arising. And I thought that this discussion today would be really great to pick Tracey's brain on some strategies, giving us some strategies and how we can manage it as HR practitioners. And I put some questions that I would like to ask Tracey, and then of course I want some questions from the guests. And then I also wanted to, as I like to do, recommend some further reading, some reading around the topic, which I always say is great. And then looking at other ways you can manage conflict in terms of Tracey's background, which is mediation. So, Tracey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you for asking me to join you today. So yes, my background's in psychology, really. I did my first degree in psychology and I loved working in clinical settings. I worked in a few psychiatric hospitals and worked in neurological rehabilitation, which meant that I helped to get people back on track who suffered a head injury. But I discovered way back then when I was in my 20s, a long time ago, that it was actually quite difficult for me at that time in my life to work in that setting. So I looked at behaviour in the workplace and I did my master's in occupational and organisational psychology. So at the time, that introduced me to things very similar to HR and very much aligned. Organisation development, stress management, change, and a little bit of conflict. And I was really interested in, looking at how differences are handled at work. So I was working in organisation development in a charity, and the in-house lawyer there, we got on very well. And she told me about a company called 𝐂𝐨𝐬𝐷𝐻, the Centre for Effective Dispute Resolution. She had just left that business. And she told me that, this is an organisation of mediators who help people resolve disputes. And I thought that's fascinating. So I contacted 𝐂𝐨𝐬𝐷𝐻. I got a job there. This is back in 2002. Probably before some of your listeners were even born. But yeah, back in 2002, I joined 𝐂𝐨𝐬𝐷𝐻 and I became an accredited mediator since 2003. And so I've spent my career, the last 20 years, helping people to either mediating disputes, whether it's commercial or employment, workplace, funerals, healthcare, it might be clinical negligence. When I'm not mediating, I teach people how to mediate and have difficult conversations. And I'm also an executive coach. So everything that I do is focused on, I suppose, giving people a voice and helping them to feel more empowered to move forwards.
Perfect. So thank you, Tracey, for introduction. Thank you. So for me, one of the key issues that I kind of recognize as a HR practitioner is that conflict, I believe, is necessary. I believe it's necessary in organizations, especially for organizations to grow and develop. And in this ever-changing world, we need to know how to manage conflict to make it, be seen as normal and not abnormal, and then also to inspire employees to raise issues, to think outside the box, even if it would cause conflict, because we want individuals to be creative and innovative. So in your experience, what are the key causes of conflicts within organizations?
Yeah, so first of all, I agree with you 100% that conflict is normal. It's inevitable. If you bring people together, you're going to have differences of opinion. And in fact, that is what's needed. You need, as you said, that creativity and innovation that happens when one person says something, somebody has a different idea. But then when it works well, you think about, well, how can I borrow from what you're saying? How can I draw on from what you're saying? And you can create something and move forwards together. So and in fact, the opposite of that, when there is no conflict and people never disagree, that's when organizations become very stale and stagnant. They stand still. So you're right, it's essential to have a variety of opinions and approaches on what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. the challenge that comes up is that if either of these conversations on what we're doing or how we're going to do it continue for too long, or perhaps they happen at the wrong time of a project. Let's say, everyone's working on a project, it's all going smoothly. Then towards the end, somebody throws a curveball in and says, well, actually, we're doing this now. It can throw people off. So that can kind of upset the apple cart, as it were. And what happens is, if conflict isn't managed well initially, it can move away from what you're doing and how you're doing it to becoming much more personalized. So it becomes, it's not a matter of shall we focus on the 6-month strategy or should we focus on marketing? It becomes, oh, I don't want to work with Sarah, she's really, really difficult. So it's trying to take the heat and managing conflict in a way so that it doesn't become personalized and it can become channeled into something more constructive. The problem, I think, exists is because most of us have never been taught how to handle disagreements. And because of that, and often these things come from childhood, right? If we think about how was conflict handled at home and when we were growing up, for some of us, it might have been something that was, conflict could be easily put to the table and we have an opportunity to talk about conflict and have disagreements with our siblings. But for others, it could be much more self-contained. You don't talk about disagreements. In fact, my parents are from Jamaica, and I was brought up in a household where it was children should be seen and not heard. So I didn't really have a voice, right? It didn't really matter, it's not having the vocabulary or the opportunity to speak about what was happening. So those things that we learned in childhood, we will bring into the workplace. And if I'm quiet, then maybe I'm more likely to be passive and not speak out at a time when I could easily have spoken out about a challenge. Likewise, if there's someone who has been brought up in a household which is much more liberal and outspoken, they might feel very free to air their challenges, and that could upset people. So it's about understanding what we do, how we engage in conflict, and then equipping ourselves to really the starting point is self-awareness. What do we do? Why do we do it? And then thinking about what does the situation require? Because conflict is inevitable and it's natural, but we have to make sure that we learn the techniques to handle it with colleagues effectively.
And
rambling, really rambling.
No, but thinking about conflict that I've managed in the workplace, and this has been conflict between employees and line managers. We've had conflict where it's resulted into a grievance, and the conflict, it turned out that the employee felt that they were being bullied rather than it was just a situation that needed to be being resolved much earlier on. And it was really down to capability, and it was down to capability and workloads. How would you have managed this going forward if it was a conflict that you felt should have been managed much earlier rather than later? And what steps can HR managers do or think about ahead of conflict arising within organizations?
So the really proactive organisations that I work with, what they do is ensure that every manager has had skills training in handling difficult conversations. That's the first thing, because it's the small things that turn into the big things, right? So if you are able to kind of nip it in the bud, address it quickly, then it won't escalate into something that becomes unmanageable and becomes so polarised. So I would and when I work in those organisations, it's often the same kinds of conversations that people have. They have disagreements about whether it's attendance, punctuality, about seating, lighting, heating, differences on not getting enough feedback or tone of feedback, feeling if the workload is too heavy, all of maybe not being promoted, but all these things, they are often never dealt with in that moment, or they're dealt with badly. So if managers have the skills to have more effective conversations around the challenges that are faced, then they're much more likely to be able to coach and bring someone with them to kind of into a better place. Likewise, HR can also coach and empower their managers with